He showed up for a blind date with only $50 in his pocket, never knowing that a single act of kindness from a stranger would change his life forever. If you believe in second chances, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Daniel Carter had never been the kind of man who thought much about himself. Most of his energy went into raising his little girl and making sure she never felt the weight of what they didn't have her. Still, on this chilly Boston evening, he found himself smoothing the sleeves of an old shirt, the fabric softened by years of wear, the collar pressed as neatly as he could manage. It wasn't new, it wasn't stylish, but it was clean. And for him, that was enough. Tonight was different. Tonight, he had taken $50 from the envelope he usually kept hidden in the back of a drawer, money set aside for emergencies, and told himself it was worth the risk. The restaurant wasn't 5-star. It wasn't the kind of place that made magazine covers, but with its polished wooden booze, its navy linens, and the quiet hum of weekday conversation, it felt like a world away from his cramped apartment. The glow from the candles on each table cast shadows that seemed softer, kinder, almost like the room itself wanted people to believe in new beginnings. Daniel paused at the door, took a breath, and stepped inside, his heart thudding with the kind of nervous hope he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't thinking of himself as a man on a date. He was a father first, a worker second, and somewhere far down the line, just Daniel. Yet, as he followed the hostess through the room, he let himself imagine what it might be like to share his life again, not just with his daughter, but with someone who might see him as more than a man carrying responsibilities. The thought both steadied and unsettled him. When he sat down at the small table by the window, he set his wallet carefully in his pocket, rehearsing silently how he would pace himself if menu prices climbed too high. He could stretch $50. He always had, but he didn't want to look like he was stretching. Not tonight. The light above his table glowed warm and low, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the night something good could begin. Daniel leaned back, his hand resting on the edge of the table, eyes drifting towards the entrance. Every few seconds he remembered the messages that had led him here. Simple and kind. A few lines that felt safe enough to say yes. That word yes had taken months, maybe years to offer again. He thought of his daughter Emma, and how she always told him he should smile more. How she'd patted his cheek one night and said, "Daddy, you need a friend." Maybe she was right. Maybe tonight was about more than just him. The room buzzed gently round him. Silverware against porcelain, glasses clinking, laughter rising and fading. For everyone else, it was just another Thursday evening. For Daniel, it was a chance, fragile and rare. He smoothed the front of his shirt once more, steadying himself, his chest tight with equal parts hope and fear. And as he glanced again toward the door, Hugh whispered inside his own mind a quiet promise that he would not let the past or the weight of worry stop him from showing up, from trying, from believing that something better might still be waiting. Daniel checked his watch once, then again, the minute hand seeming to drag as if it too were caught in the weight of waiting. 6:45 had slipped into 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock became 7:15 each time the door opened. His head lifted with a small rush of hope, only for it to fall again as couples wandered in together, laughing, brushing snowflakes from their coats. He told himself to be patient. Maybe she was caught in traffic. Maybe she had stopped to fix her hair. Maybe, just maybe, she would still walk through the door. By 7:30, the excuses had worn thin. Daniel scrolled through his phone, reading the last line she had sent that afternoon. "Can't wait to see you tonight." The words were there, glowing on the screen, so familiar it hurt. He tapped out a quick message. "I'm here, just checking in." He watched the screen, waiting for the little dots that never came. The silence stretched. His heart began to sink with the realization he had been pushing away. When the buzz finally came, his body jolted as though pulled toward hope again. But the words that appeared froze him in place. "Wow, you actually went. I was just messing with you. Sorry, but you're not really my type. Not worth the Uber." A second message followed almost immediately. "You seem nice, but seriously, you thought I was actually coming." Daniel stared, the letters blurring for a moment, as if the phone itself had betrayed him. He pressed his lips together hard. willing back the sting that threatened to rise in his ice around him. The restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened. Forks scraping plates, soft music spilling from hidden speakers. The low hum of conversation chat belonged to people who were wanted, people who belonged. He sat still, holding his phone in his hand as though releasing it would mean accepting it was real. Heat crept up his neck, the kind of heat that comes not from anger, but from humiliation. He reached for the water glass in front of him, swallowing slowly, anything to keep from breaking the silence inside his chest. The server passed by, offering a polite smile. "Would you like to order something?" Sir Daniel shook his head quickly, his voice catching in his throat. "No, thank you. I'm still waiting." But he wasn't. He knew it. He shifted in his seat, opening his worn wallet under the table. Inside was a single folded bill. A $5 he had promised himself he wouldn't touch unless he absolutely had to. $50 had already felt like too much. But at least he had carried the quiet hope of sharing a meal, of not eating alone. Now even that was gone. He placed the wallet back in his pocket, fingers trembling as he pulled the napkin tighter across his lap, trying to mask the hollow ache in his stomach. Told himself not to cry. Men didn't cry in public, not men with children to raise and pride to protect. But there was no denying the weight pressing on his chest, the familiar whisper that maybe he wasn't enough, never enough, to be worth showing up for. He straightened his back, forcing his shoulders tall, the way he did whenever Emma asked if everything was going to be okay. He could play the part here, too, even if no one was watching. The minutes trickled by. Couples leaned across tables, hands brushing, eyes sparkling in the candlelight. Daniel sat alone, his glass nearly empty, the water doing little to calm the hunger that clawed at him. His jaw tightened, his gaze fixed once more on the door, as if willpower alone might conjure the figure who would never appear. And still, he stayed, clinging to the small, stubborn hope that showing up, even to nothing, might mean something. Because if he gave up on even that, what else was left to believe in? Victoria Sterling had come to the restaurant that evening out of habit more than need. After a long day off meetings and presentations at Sterling Organics, she often chose this quiet corner table to unwind. The polished wood, the low candle light, the steady rhythm of silverware and soft music. It gave her space to think, to exhale. Her phone buzzed with unread emails, but she'd set it face down beside her glass of wine. For once, she wanted to be present in a room instead of buried in numbers and projections. It was then that she noticed him, a man sitting by the window, his shirt simple, pressed with the kind of care that speaks louder than any designer label. His posture was straight, almost too straight, as though he carried the weight of holding himself together. Every few minutes, his eyes flickered toward the entrance with a hope so raw it made her pause. She had seen confidence in boardrooms, ambition in negotiations, arrogance at networking events. But hope, that fragile, trembling thing, was rare. At first, Victoria told herself not to starry. People came and went, lives crossed in silence all the time. Yet, something about the way he clutched his phone, how his thumb hovered over the screen as if willing it to light up, tugged at her attention. She saw the faint tightening of his jaw when it finally did, the flicker of relief that flashed across his face, only to be crushed an instant later. He read the message again, and though she couldn't see the words, she knew the language. Disappointment had a way of etching itself into posture, into the slope of a shoulder, into the dimming of a gaze. Victoria leaned back slightly, letting her wine rest on the table. She was no stranger to rejection, though hers had often come dressed in boardroom suits and carefully worded letters. Still, she recognized that expression, the stubborn straightening of the spine, the desperate attempt to look unaffected, while the heart cracked quietly underneath. It stirred something in her, something she thought she had trained herself to ignore in this world of profit margins and polished facades. Her eyes softened as she continued to observe him. The glass of water on his table was nearly empty, and still naple had been set down. She noticed how his fingers tapped gently against them, not impatiently, but nervously, like a man debating whether to leave or to hold out just a little longer. He wasn't just waiting for dinner. He was waiting to be chosen, to matter, to be worth the effort of someone walking through the door. And when that someone never arrived, she saw the loneliness spread across his face like a shadow. Victoria felt an unexpected ache in her chest. She had built her life on control, on being Theon who decided outcomes. But here she was watching a stranger being quiet lubricant by a cruel trick, and she could not shake the thought that kindness, simple and uncalculated, might mean more in this moment than any deal she had ever closed. She let out a slow breath, her decision forming as natural, as if it had been waiting there all along. Her gaze lingered once more on the man in the worn shirt with the hopeful ice note dimmed. Something inside her whispered that this wasn't a chance. It was a reminder that even the smallest act of seeing another person could change the course of an evening, maybe even a life. And as she raised her hand to catch the attention of a server, Victoria knew she was about to do something she hadn't done in a long time. Step out of her world of distancia and into someone else's quiet need. The decision came to her as naturally as breathing. Victoria lifted her hand and caught the eye of a passing server, leaning in just enough so their quiet exchange wouldn't draw attention. "A plate of your pasta, the house favorite," she murmured, sliding her card across the tray before he could even nod, "and a glass of sparkling lemonade. Charge it now. Deliver it to the man by the window." The server hesitated only a moment, then nodded, recognizing the weight in her tone. Victoria picked up her wine again, as if nothing had happened, though her pulse carried a soft urgency she hadn't felt in years. Daniel didn't notice her at first when the steaming plate was set down in front of him. He blinked, confused, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't order this," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. The server smiled kindly, repeating the line Victoria had asked him to give. "It's been taken care of, sir. Millionaire requested it for you, and the bill is already settled." Daniel froze, the napkin slipping from his lap to the floor. His first instinct wasn't gratitude, but suspicion. Was this another joke? Another cruel reminder that the world could be merciless? He looked around, searching the faces at nearby tables for smirks, for laughter, waiting to explode at his expense. That was when her voice reached him. Low, even steady. "It's not charity," Victoria said from just behind him, her words threading gently through the air. "It's a reminder. You deserve to eat, even if the world tries to tell you otherwise." Daniel turned, startled, and his eyes landed on her, a woman in an elegant blazer, hair pinned with effortless grace, her gaze calm yet unyielding. She wasn't smiling to dazzle him. She wasn't pitying him. She was simply present, and in that presence, there was a kind of honesty he hadn't known how much he needed. "I don't," he began, but the words caught. No one had ever said something like that to him. He had been told to toughen up, to make do, to push through. Never that he deserved something as simple, as human as a warm meal. Victoria stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on the back of the chair across from his. "May I?" she asked, though her tone suggested she would sit regardless of his answer. Daniel nodded numbly, still reeling for a moment. Neither spoke. The only sound between them was the faint fizz off lemonade glass, and the hum of the restaurant around them. Daniel's hand hovered above the fork, uncertain as stuff accepting the food meant accepting a kindness he wasn't sure how to hold. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I know," Victoria replied, her eyes steady on his. "That's why it matters." The words settled between them like a stone in a still pond, rippling outward. Daniel looked down at the pasta, the steam curling upward, warm and real. His stomach twisted with hunger, but it washed his chest that had the most, because in that single moment, he realized someone had seen him, not as a man left behind, not as a father barely scraping by, but as a person worthy of notice. He lifted the fork at last, his movement attentive, as though testing the truth of her gesture. The first bite broke something open inside him. It wasn't just food. It was dignity served on a plate, a reminder that hadn't been entirely invisible. And as he swallowed, his eyes flicked up again to meet hers. Victoria's expression hadn't changed. Calm, direct, certain. Daniel set the fork down, his voice unsteady, but sincere. "No one's ever said that to me before." Victoria leaned back slightly, her own glass of wine untouched, her lips curving in the faintest shadow of a smile. Then it was long overdue. Victoria didn't come to the table with the air of someone trying to impress. She moved with a quiet confidence, setting her glass of wine down before pulling the chair across from him, and settling in as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, still trying to reconcile the plate in front of him with the stranger who had paid for it. He opened his mouth, ready to insist again that she didn't have to, but her expression stopped him. There was no trace of pity, no trace of superiority, just a calm steadiness, like someone who had decided to stay a while. She spoke first, her voice low now that it felt like the words were meant for him alone. "You showed up," she said, "and you waited, not because you were desperate, but because you believed." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "That matters more than you think." The sentence landed with surprising force. Daniel felt his throat tighten, the weight of her words brushing against something he had buried for years. Held it down quickly, focusing on the plate instead of her eyes. His fork trembled in his hand, but he forced himself to take a bite. The pasta was warm, rich, comforting in a way that startled him. He hadn't realized just how long it had been since he'd eaten anything that felt like more than survival. Victoria didn't fill the silence with questions or small talk. She let the space stretch gently, giving him room to eat, to breathe. When she did speak, her tone carried no agenda, only curiosity without pressure. "Long day?" she asked softly, glancing at his tired shoulders. The way his sleeves were rolled unevenly as if he had rushed here straight from work. Daniel gave a small nod. "Most of them are," he admitted, his voice rough, buffonist, her lips curved. Not quite a smile, but something close. "I know the feeling." She left it there, not prying, not pressing him to explain. The conversation moved in quiet circles, light touches instead of heavy demands. They spoke about the restaurant's music, about the strange Boston weather that could never make up its mind, and about how the pasta recipe had apparently been passed down from the owner's grandmother. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't an interrogation. It was simply two people sharing space at the same table. And for Daniel, it was enough, more than enough. As he ate, something in him softened. Each bite pushed away the gnawing hunger in his stomach, but it also eased the ache of invisibility. He wasn't alone tonight. Not entirely. He was being seen, spoken to, acknowledged in a way that reminded him he was still here, still human, still worthy of sitting at a table with someone who could have easily ignored him. When the plate was finally empty, Daniel set down his fork slowly, as if afraid the spell might break with fellest bite. Victoria reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a small white card, and slid it across the table. "I come here often," she said, her tone still gentle, without pressure. "Sometimes for the coffee, never for the company. But if you ever feel like being seen again, you know where to find me." Daniel stared at the card resting against the candlelight. Her name printed in bold letters, the till beneath it heavier than anything he could have imagined. He looked up, but she was already rising, her glass of wine barely touched. She gave him a small nod. Not a goodbye, not a promise, but something in between, and walked toward the door. For a long moment, Daniel stayed seated, the card still warm from her hand lying against his palm. The room buzzed on around him, but all he could hear was the echo of her words. "You showed up. You believed." And maybe for the first time in years, that was enough to carry him through the night. A week later, Daniel pushed open the door of a small cafe tucked between the public library and a row of old brick buildings. It was the kind of place he stopped at only when his budget allowed, usually for a plain coffee and a few quiet minutes. While Emma colored at the library across the street, the air inside carried the warm scent of cinnamon and roasted beans, a sharp contrast to the biting chill outside. He stepped up to the counter, fumbling with his worn wallet, silently counting the bills he had tucked aside for the small indulgence before he could order. A familiar voice drifted from behind him. "Make it 2 and add oat milk ties." The barista looked past Daniel, nodded, and rang it up without a question. Daniel turned startled, and there she was, Victoria sitting in the corner near the window, a laptop open in front of her, sleeves off her blazer rolled up just enough to make her look less like a CEO, and more like someone simply passing the morning. He hesitated, unsure if he should walk over. Maybe she wanted to be left alone. Maybe what had happened at the restaurant was just a fleeting kindness. Nothing more. But when the barista handed him the cup and pointed toward her table, Daniel felt his feet moving before his doubts could stop him. "You remembered my coffee," he said quietly as he approached, setting the cup down on her table. "I remembered your courage," Victoria replied, her eyes meeting his with the same calm honesty he had seen that night. The coffee was the easy part. Daniel let out a short breath, half a law, half a sigh, and sat down across from her. For a moment, they simply sipped their drinks, letting the soft hum of conversation and the golden morning light fill the space between them. It didn't feel like a CEO sitting across from a single father. It felt like two people pausing in the middle of their lives to share a table. Victoria broke the silence first, a smile tugging at her lips. "You know, my team just botched a whole campaign last month, tried to launch a toddler snack line, and the slogan ended up sounding like we were advertising chewing gum for babies." Daniel blinked, surprised, then let out a laugh. Genuine, unforced. "That sounds like something my daughter Stecker would complain about." Victoria chuckled, shaking her head. "A food blogger roasted us online. The meme went viral. My board still hasn't let me live it down." She said it not with arrogance, not with self-pity, but with the kind of ease that comes from someone who had learned to laugh at her own mistakes. The weight Daniel had carried into the cafe began to ease. She wasn't questioning him about his life, wasn't dissecting his choices, wasn't offering him pity. She was just talking, letting him laugh at something that wasn't survival or responsibility. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't performing or apologizing. He was simply present. They talked about coffee preferences, about Boston's unpredictable weather, and about the odd childhood snacks each of them used to love. The conversation flowed without effort, light and genuine, surprising them both with how easy it felt. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he expected her to suggest another meeting to hand him another card to make the moment heavier than it needed to be. But she only smiled, gave a small nod, and let him go. As he stepped back into the cold air, Daniel realized he was smiling too. Not because he had been rescued, not because someone had taken pity on him, but because someone had listened, remembered, and shared laughter without asking for anything in return. And for a man who had grown used to being invisible, that simple truth was enough to carry with him. A week after their quiet morning at the cafe, an unexpected mess lit up Daniel's phone. It was short, almost casual, yet carried few weight of an invitation he never imagined receiving. "Thought this might align with your world. No pressure, Victoria." Attached was a digital pass to a workshop on early childhood nutrition hosted by Sterling Organics. Daniel hesitated at first. He wasn't a doctor, not a researcher, not anyone with a polished title. He was just a father who had learned through trial and error how to stretch $1 into a meal. But something in her wording, no pressure, pushed him to show up. The conference room was filled with pediatricians, young mothers, and students scribbling notes. Daniel sat near the back, his posture uncertain at first, but the slides on the screen drew him in. Charts about preservatives, allergens, and labels that never seemed clear enough when the speaker asked if anyone had questions. His hand went up before he realized it. "What about single parents who don't have time to cook everything fresh?" Daniel asked. His voice was steady, but carried the honesty of lived experience. "Sometimes you're choosing between frozen dinners or nothing. What should we be looking for on the labels when time and money are both against you?" The room grew still, eyes turning his way. The speaker paused, then smiled. "That's Avery, good question." He launched into an answer about balancing convenience with safety, about understanding hidden preservatives. Later, when Daniel pointed out a smell inconsistency in the allergy labeling on one of the sample boxes, the expert stopped mid-sentence. Sharp observation, he admitted. Heads around the room nodded from the back. Victoria watched quietly, arms folded across her tailored blazer. She had seen ambitious interns ask clever questions. She had seen experts debate technical points. But this was different. Daniel wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't rehearsed. He was a father speaking because it mattered to his child, and that kind of honesty could not be taught. After the session ended, Daniel slipped out quickly, avoiding the cluster of people trading business cards. He had no resume to hand out, no pitch to make. He simply gathered his coat and headed toward the library down the block, where Emma often waited for him after school. The library was warm, quiet, with the faint smell of old paper and polished wood. In the children's corner, Emma sat cross-legged on the rug, her pigtails uneven, her tiny hands flipping through a picture book. When she looked up and saw her father, she ran straight into his arms. Daniel lifted her easily, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his face softening in a way Victoria had never seen before. She had followed, not intruding, just curious enough to step inside. Emma noticed her first. The little girl peeked shyly from behind her father's shoulder, her wide eyes studying the elegant woman who stood a few steps away. Slowly, she slid down from Daniel's arms, tugging at his sleeve before stepping closer to Victoria. Her tiny fingers reached for the hem of Victoria's coat, and she whispered with innocent certainty, "She smells like Mommy." The air seemed to still. Daniel froze, his breath caught sharp in his chest. His eyes darted to Victoria, then back to his daughter, as if unsure how to shield them both from the weight of those words. Victoria's composure faltered. Her throat tightened as the child's whisper sank deep. Bypassing alt armor she wore in boardrooms, she crouched slowly, meeting Emma's gaze with a softness she hadn't allowed herself in years. "That's a big compliment," she said gently, her voice tender. "Your mommy must have smelled like kindness." Emma nodded solemnly, satisfied before skipping back toward the shelves. Daniel stood rooted in place, his eyes glassy, though he refused to let the tears fall. He cleared his throat, managing only a quiet, "She doesn't usually say things like that." Victoria looked at him, then really looked, and saw not just a man abandoned at a dinner table, but a father holding on for his little girl. In that fragile, unguarded moment, something shifted between them, something neither had expected, but neither could deny. It began quietly, almost without either of them noticing. After that day in the library, Victoria found herself reaching out more often, not for meetings or contracts, but for something simpler. She would send Daniel a draft of a product label or a photo of new packaging and ask, "Would a parent like you actually trust this?" His answers were never polished, never dressed in business jargon, but they carried the weight of honesty. And in boardrooms where numbers often drowned out common sense, his voice began to matter. Daniel, in turn, found himself leaning on her in ways he hadn't expected. On the evenings, when his shifts ran late or when Emma's daycare closed early, Victoria would stop by without hesitation. She never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes it was a stack of coloring books, sometimes just her calm presence, but always, Emma lit up the moment she walked in. It wasn't planned. It wasn't formal. It was simply becoming routine, a rhythm that slid into their lives as naturally as breathing. One night, that rhythm deepened. Emma had come down with a fever, her small body curled under a blanket on the couch. Daniel hovered anxiously, torn between the soup simmering on the stove and the worry knotting in his chest. When Victoria knocked softly and stepped inside, she didn't ask permission. She simply knelt beside the little girl, pressing a cool hand to her forehead. From her bag, she pulled a folded cloth, soaked in a lavender compress, and placed it gently across Emma's brow. The child's breathing eased almost instantly, her lashes fluttering as her body relaxed. And then Victoria began Tom. At first, it was barely more than a whisper, a melody threaded into the quiet of the room. Daniel froze, the ladle slipping from his hand, because he knew that tune. His late wife had sung it countless nights when Emma was small. A folk lullaby altered with silly words to make that child laugh through her tears. Hearing it now was like having a door to the past cracked open, a flood of memory rushing through. He sank into the armchair, his head in his hands, shoulders trembling with a grief he had kept locked away. Tears spilled before he could stop them. Victoria's voice wavered for half a moment when she noticed, but she kept singing until Emma drifted into sleep. Only then did she turn her gaze toward Daniel. He tried to apologize to explain why hearing that song had broken him apart, but the words tangled in his throat. "You couldn't have known," he whispered finally, his voice. Victoria shook her head gently, her own eyes shining, though she held them steady. "I didn't have to know," she said softly. "Some things just find their way back." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of loss, of memory, of something new settling quietly between them. No declarations, no confessions, but the truth of what was forming could be felt in every breath they shared. From that night forward, they moved through life differently. Victoria still asked for his thoughts on campaigns. Daniel still leaned on her when work pulled him away. Emma still looked for her at bedtime, expecting 2 stories instead of 1. And though none of them spoke the word, it was clear Tonyan watching. Slowly, steadily, the line between their separate lives blurred until 3 people, once strangers, had begun to weave themselves into something resembling a family. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, its edges smudged from the postman's hands. Daniel stared at it for a long time before daring to open it, his fingers trembling as if they already knew the weight of what was inside. When he finally unfolded the paper, his eyes darted to the first line and then froze. A full scholarship, a year-long training program in Oregon, specialized certification that could change everything for him and Emma. His chest swelled with pride, but almost immediately the pride collapsed into fear, because opportunity, he knew, often came at the cost of what you loved most. For 3 days, he carried the letter folded in his pocket, its corners softening from his constant touch. Every time he looked at Victoria, every time Emma reached for her hand, he felt the words pressing harder against him. Emma giggled, pulling a folded paper from her backpack. She spread it across the table proudly. A drawing of 3 stick figures at a dinner table under a roof with a yellow door. "This is us," she said. "Daddy, Mommy, and me." Daniel's eyes shimmered as he looked from the drawing to the 2 faces before him. A year ago, he had walked into this restaurant with nothing but $50 and a fragile hope. Now, he sat at the same table with everything he had ever needed: love, family, and a future that no longer felt out of reach. Candlelight flickered. Laughter rose from nearby tables. And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe without reservation. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, just a quiet miracle. 3 chairs at 1 table, and the beginning of a life they would build together. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment when kindness changed everything? Share it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you'd like more stories that remind us of hope, love, and second chances, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support means the world, and it helps me bring more of these heartfelt tales to you. Thank you for being here, and remember, some of the message showing up can change a life.